Title: The River of Scorpions, Chapter 1. The Whisper of the River. James was always drawn to rivers. He never understood why. He'd always been a city boy, raised in the bustling streets of a place where rivers were mere utilities, something to cross, not to linger by. Yet, as long as he could remember, rivers held a strange power over him, an inexplicable pull. It wasn't their gentle flow or the way the sun danced on their surface. It was the darkness beneath, like a promise of something beyond understanding, something that could swallow you whole if you dared approach. The day he found Scorpion River was an accident, though not one that surprised him. There had always been rumors of a river that twisted its way through the forest far beyond Perelford, a place where no one dared to venture, where the trees grew thick, choking out the light, and where even the most seasoned travelers had disappeared without a trace. Most people in the small town of Perelford had never set foot near the river. They whispered about it, told their children to avoid it, and old women would shake their heads solemnly whenever the subject was broached. "It takes what it wants," they said in hushed voices. "It never lets go." James, however, had always been curious. He was one of those people who couldn't ignore the pull of the unknown, no matter how chilling. So, one rainy afternoon, with nothing but the sounds of thunder overhead, he ventured into the woods. The journey had been long. Hours passed, and the dense woods gave way to a creeping mist that hung in the air like an oppressive blanket, damp and cold. The trees here were ancient, their gnarled branches twisted into grotesque shapes, their trunks warped and scarred as if the forest itself had endured countless battles over the years. James felt the weight of the place pressing down on him, as though the very land was alive, watching. The deeper he went, the more the air seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as if the mist itself was made of something more than fog. His footsteps became muted, swallowed by the soft earth, as though the ground didn't want to let him pass. When he finally reached the river, he wasn't sure what he had expected, but it certainly wasn't this. The water was dark, almost black, swirling unnaturally around jagged rocks, as though something beneath the surface was causing the current to fight itself. It wasn't the kind of river one would want to swim in or even approach too closely. There was something unwelcoming, something that felt like an ancient and malicious force lingering beneath its waters. James stood at the edge for a long moment, watching the river churn and bubble, as if it were alive. The air smelled of wet earth, and something more, a scent he couldn't quite place. It was as if the river was breathing, pulling the very life out of the surrounding trees. That's when he heard it, the whisper. It was faint at first, a soft murmur just on the edge of hearing. He strained to listen, thinking it was the wind or perhaps the rustling of leaves. But no, the voice came again, clearer now, though it sounded distant, like it was calling from the other side of the river. "Come closer." James stepped forward instinctively, his heart pounding in his chest. It was strange. He should have been afraid, but instead, he felt an overwhelming urge to listen, to understand the voice. It was seductive, gentle, coaxing. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly, though he couldn't explain why. There was no answer, just the sound of the river lapping against the rocks. Then, as if on cue, a shape emerged from the depths. At first, it was a ripple in the water, barely noticeable, but then it became more distinct, more defined. A figure rose from the dark depths of the river, its form twisting and shifting like something that didn't belong to the world of the living. James staggered backward, his breath catching in his throat. The figure seemed to float just above the water's surface, its features obscured by shadows, its body a mass of indistinct shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. The only thing he could make out clearly were its eyes, glowing with a faint ethereal light, locking onto him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He wanted to run, but his feet felt rooted to the spot, frozen in place by a force stronger than fear. The figure spoke again, this time with a voice that seemed to come from all around him, not just the river. It was low, almost a growl, but with an undeniable clarity. "James," it whispered, You've come to listen." His throat went dry. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. The figure's mouth parted, revealing rows of sharp teeth that glinted in the dim light. But it wasn't the teeth that drew his gaze. No, It was the space behind the figure, the water that rippled like a curtain pulled aside, revealing something far worse. Something was waiting beneath the surface. A mass of eyes, glinting white in the murky water, all staring up at him, their pupils wide and hungry. He felt them watching him, felt their cold, dead gaze seeping into his skin, into his very soul. "I've been waiting," the figure whispered again, "waiting for you to cross. And now that you have, there's no turning back." The words sent a jolt of terror through James. His body was no longer his own. He felt it. A pull, a terrible aching pull towards the river. The voice was inside his mind now, inside his very thoughts, as though the figure was forcing him to listen. "You came searching," it said, "searching for something you didn't understand. And now, you will know the truth." The water began to churn violently, waves rising higher, splashing over the edge, soaking his shoes. The pull became stronger, like an invisible hand dragging him closer to the river. His heart pounded faster, his breath quickening, but his body refused to obey him. Every step felt heavier, as if the very ground beneath him was trying to keep him from stepping into the water. The figure in the river smiled, showing more of its twisted, sharp teeth. "You cannot resist," it whispered. "The river owns you now. There is no escaping its grasp." James tried to scream, but his mouth was dry, his voice failing him. His hands trembled as he reached for the nearest tree, grabbing onto its bark to steady himself. But the tree felt wrong, its texture too smooth, too soft, as if it had been shaped by hands that weren't human. The figure's eyes locked onto his once more. "You're mine now," it said softly. "You belong to the river." And with those final words, the world seemed to collapse around James. The ground gave way, and before he could react, the river surged forward with unnatural force, swallowing him whole. 44. The darkness that engulfed him was suffocating. The water, cold and clammy, filled his lungs. But he didn't drown. He sank deeper and deeper, pulled down by unseen hands, by a force older than the earth itself. Every struggle he made only seemed to drag him further into the black void, deeper into the river's heart. And through it all, the voice echoed in his mind, growing louder, more insistent. "There is no escape. You belong to us, forever." As James's vision blurred and his body grew weaker, he understood. The river didn't just take you. It consumed you. It stripped away everything you were, leaving nothing but the cold, empty void of eternity. But before he lost consciousness, a final thought flickered through his mind. Was it ever possible to escape? Or had it already begun long before he'd set foot near the river? Part 2. James couldn't remember how long he had been underwater. It felt like an eternity, but at the same time, only an instant. His limbs were heavy, his body struggling against the relentless grip of the water. Every attempt to break free only dragged him deeper into the river's unseen depths. His chest burned, each desperate inhale met with a cold, choking breath that filled his lungs with the bitter taste of river water. The world above the surface had faded into nothingness, swallowed by the murky blackness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The weight of the water pressing against him grew unbearable, as if the river itself was a living, breathing entity, tightening its grip with every passing second. But just as he thought his strength would give out, something shifted. There was a subtle movement beneath him, a pull that wasn't the current. It was something more intentional, something that knew him, beckoning him deeper into its cold embrace. His eyes, bloodshot and burning from the suffocating water, flicked open again, but it didn't matter. The dark, swollen mass of the river had swallowed him whole, its vastness suffocating all around him. A sudden tug on his ankle sent a shock of panic through him. Something had grabbed him. His heart pounded faster, fear crashing through his chest like a tidal wave. He tried to kick, tried to swim upward, but his legs felt like lead, dragging him back down with every futile attempt to rise. And then came the voice again, no longer distant, no longer a whisper. It was inside him, inside his head, his bones, his very soul. "You belong to us." The voice was no longer smooth, nor coaxing. It was cold, ancient, as though it had spoken those words 1,000 times before to others who had come before him. others who were now lost to the depths of the river. The words reverberated inside his mind, pulling him under like a weight he could never escape. Suddenly he felt something in the water, cold, soft tendrils that wrapped themselves around his legs, coiling like serpents. The grip tightened. He twisted his body, kicking out violently, trying to break free, but the river fought back with overwhelming strength, pulling him deeper. It was then that he saw it, the river's true form. Not just the inky blackness, but something else. Emerging from the darkness, from the depths of the river itself, James saw shadows that weren't simply reflections of trees or rocks. These were figures, twisted and malformed, rising slowly toward him. There were faces, distorted and wide-eyed, their mouths open in silent screams that never quite reached his ears, as if trapped in some endless loop of horror. Their hands reached out, long fingers curling, stretching, begging for release. They were once people, James realized with a start. Once people who had come here like he did, believing they could survive the river's grip. But now, they were only shadows, lost souls, trapped in the river's embrace, doomed to repeat their final moments forever. "James!" a voice rasped, a thin, gurgling sound that seemed to rise from the very bottom of the river. It was the same voice he had heard before, the one that had called to him from the shore. It was closer now, much closer, and its tone had shifted again. This time, it was commanding, demanding. "You cannot escape. You will never leave." He tried to scream, but the water filled his mouth, drowning his words before they could escape. He struggled to push the dark figures away, but they only came closer, their cold, bony hands brushing against his skin, their touch sending chills through his body. His panic rose again, his thoughts clouded with terror. The river wanted him. It always had. And as if in response to his fear, the river's grip tightened, pulling him deeper still. His lungs burned, the air fading faster with each passing second. The faces of the lost souls surrounded him, their hollow eyes staring into his soul, pleading with him silently for a way out. But there was no escape. The river had claimed them, and now it had claimed him too. He fought against it one last time, thrashing violently, trying to claw his way toward the surface. But it was no use. The last thing James saw before the darkness swallowed him whole was the figure on the shore, its glowing eyes watching him, waiting. Part 2. The Descent. James awoke in the darkness, but not in the way he had expected. His body didn't feel like it was floating. No, it felt solid, rooted to the earth beneath him. The water was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness that seemed to press down from all sides. His eyes fluttered open, but the world around him was pitch black. The air was thick, dense with a coldness that seemed to seep into his bones. There was no sound, no birds, no wind, no ripples of water lapping at the shore, just a thick, suffocating silence. He was no longer in the river, but where was he? He pushed himself to his feet, his body aching as if it had been broken and remade. His muscles screamed in protest, but he forced himself to move, taking cautious steps forward. There was nothing around him, no trees, no rocks, no familiar signs of the world he had known. The ground beneath his feet was slick and wet, the texture foreign to him. As he moved, the darkness shifted, thickening around him, closing in like the walls of a tomb. The air grew colder with each step, the breath in his chest now visible in front of him, a faint mist swirling in the emptiness. He could hear his heart beat, loud and frantic in his ears, but other than that, there was nothing. "Where am I?" he thought to himself, his mind racing. He reached out, his hand brushing against the air, feeling something, the faintest presence, as if the darkness itself was alive, watching him. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the silence was broken by a whisper. It was a voice, though not the one he had heard earlier. This one was deeper, heavier, almost guttural, like the earth itself was speaking. But there was something else beneath it, a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down his spine. "James, come closer." The voice spoke his name with such certainty, such familiarity, that his heart skipped a beat. He felt his body freeze, his muscles locking up as though an invisible force had taken hold of him. He knew he shouldn't move closer, shouldn't listen to whatever it was that called to him. But the pull was undeniable. The urge to obey the voice was overwhelming, a force stronger than his own will. The temperature dropped even further, and with it, a sense of impending doom crept into his chest. His instincts screamed at him to turn and run, to get away from whatever was waiting for him in the dark. But his body didn't respond. His feet moved of their own accord, dragging him toward the source of the voice. "James, come closer," the voice repeated. And this time it was not a question. It was a command. James took a shaky step forward, then another. Each step felt like he was sinking deeper into the unknown, like he was walking into the heart of something ancient, something evil. His thoughts swirled in chaos, but all he could hear now was the voice, loud, deafening, pulling him forward. And as he walked, he realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity that the river was never just a river. It was something far darker. It was a door, a threshold, a boundary between worlds. And now, James had crossed it. He was no longer just in a place. He was in a state of being that no living soul had ever returned from. The whispering voice rose in volume, and suddenly, the darkness began to part. He could see shapes now, vague and fleeting, moving around him, circling him. Faces appeared in the shadows, twisted and contorted, their eyes wide with horror. They were not human, not anymore. They were something else, something that had been trapped in this space, bound to it for eternity. They reached for him, their bony fingers stretching, scraping at the air, desperate to touch him, to pull him into the abyss with them. And then, as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw it. A figure in the distance, standing still, waiting for him. Its eyes glowed faintly, the same eyes he had seen before on the riverbank, and as it beckoned to him, he realized the terrible truth. There would be no escape, not from this place, not from the river. Chapter 2. The Echo of the River. Part 1. James had no idea how long he had been drifting. His sense of time had blurred in the endless void between wakefulness and nightmares, between reality and whatever strange world had claimed him. But he was conscious now, fully awake, feeling the weight of his body pressing against something cold and solid beneath him. He tried to move, but his limbs were stiff, as if the water had not only drenched him but left him paralyzed, locked in place by the cold embrace of the river. His eyelids flickered open, and for a moment he thought he was back at the riverbank. The mist was still thick around him, swirling in tendrils of pale grey, clinging to the ground like the remnants of forgotten dreams. The trees around him were twisted, their branches curling upward in grotesque shapes, the dark bark almost black in the muted light. But as he looked closer, he realized something had changed. The trees weren't trees anymore. They were something else. They had taken on a twisted form, their bark now slick and wet, dripping like blood from some unseen wound. James sat up, his breath quickening as his surroundings seemed to close in on him. The air was stifling, heavy with the scent of decay. He could taste it on his tongue, like rust and mold, clinging to the back of his throat. He wiped his face with his trembling hand, only to find that his fingers were covered in a strange, dark liquid that looked like oil but smelled like rotten flesh. He glanced around, but there was nothing familiar. No road signs, no distant hum of traffic, no sign of civilization. Just the endless stretch of twisted trees and fog, their forms distorted in the haze, as though the world itself was warping before his eyes. Then, as his gaze fell to the ground, he noticed the footprints. Large, heavy, deliberate marks that seemed to lead deeper into the forest. They were fresh, the edges still faintly damp as though someone, or something, had just passed through, but the prints weren't human. No, they were too large, too malformed. The toes of the tracks were misshapen, elongated like claws, sinking deeply into the earth as if they were made by a creature far heavier than any man. James didn't want to follow the trail. He didn't want to know where it led. But something compelled him, a force stronger than his fear, pushing him forward. He had no choice but to follow the path laid out before him, drawn by an unseen hand, as though the forest itself had a plan for him, one he could not escape. He took a hesitant step forward, and then another, the wet ground squelching beneath his boots. The trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted limbs reaching toward him like skeletal hands. The air grew thicker with every step, suffocating him with a sense of dread. He could feel eyes on him, though he saw no one. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the faintest whispers in the distance. He stopped, his heart racing, as a chill ran down his spine. The whispers were growing louder now. Not just one voice, but many, layered over each other like a chorus of shadows. They seemed to come from all directions, their words unintelligible, but unmistakably urgent. "James! James! Come closer!" The voices seemed to beckon him, calling his name with a disturbing familiarity, as if they had been waiting for him all this time. He spun around, trying to locate the source of the sound, but the forest remained still, empty. And yet, the whispers continued, growing louder, more frantic. "James, you belong to us. Come closer." James felt a sudden wave of nausea wash over him, a deep gnawing sensation in his stomach, as though the very earth beneath him was alive, feeding on his fear. He clutched at his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The voices were everywhere now, a cacophony of haunting calls that echoed in his skull. It felt like they were inside his head, digging into his thoughts, reaching for something deep inside him, something that shouldn't have been there. In the distance, something moved. James froze, his body tensing in instinctual terror. It was a figure, tall and thin, draped in the shadows of the trees. The figure stood motionless, its shape obscured by the mist, but James could see the outline, too tall, too thin, and the way it moved was unnatural. It didn't walk like a person, but more like a puppet on strings, jerking forward in sudden, sharp movements that made his stomach twist. And then it spoke. "James." The voice came from the figure, but it was not the same voice that had been whispering in his ears. This voice was deeper, darker, like the sound of something ancient, something beyond comprehension. The figure moved again, its long arms stretching out toward him, its fingers elongated like claws, reaching for him with an unnatural hunger. "James, we've been waiting." The words sent a shiver through his entire body, a tremor that shook him to the core. He wanted to run, to escape, but his legs wouldn't move. But it was as though the very ground had rooted him to the spot, holding him in place. His heart pounded in his chest, and sweat dripped down his face as he fought to control his breath. The figure took another step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, two pinpricks of light that seemed to burn with an unnatural intensity. James could feel them on him, burning through him, as though they were reaching deep into his soul. "You can't leave, James," the voice whispered. "You never could." Suddenly, everything shifted. The air grew colder, and the world around him seemed to distort. The trees bent and swayed in unnatural rhythms, their branches reaching toward him like tendrils. The ground beneath him shifted, the soil breaking apart, as if the earth itself was moving to swallow him whole. And all the while, the figure remained, its eyes never leaving him, its voice whispering softly, urgently, like a promise. "You're part of this now, James," it whispered. "We will never let you go." The ground beneath him opened, a crack forming in the earth, its edges jagged and sharp. From the fissure, a sickly green light spilled out, illuminating the figure in a grotesque glow. James tried to scream, but his throat had gone dry. The fear was so overwhelming that it paralyzed him, leaving him unable to move. The figure stretched its arms toward him, and before he could react, he felt something cold wrap around his ankle, yanking him backward. He stumbled, falling to the ground as the earth seemed to swallow him, pulling him toward the crack in the ground, pulling him into the waiting darkness. "No!" James cried out, but his voice was swallowed by the abyss. The figure loomed above him, its presence overwhelming, and as the ground tore open, James realized with sickening clarity that this was no ordinary place. This was a realm, a forgotten space between worlds, a space where the lost souls of the river resided, where time and space no longer held sway. He had crossed the threshold. There would be no escape. Part 2. A chilling reunion. James's world flipped again, disorienting, like he had been thrown into a spinning vortex. His body slammed against the cold, rough ground, the shock jarring his senses. He groaned in pain, struggling to lift his head, to understand where he was, but the world around him was a blur. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing against his chest as though the very atmosphere was out to crush him. His eyes stung and he blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision. But everything remained dark, suffused with a sickly, unnatural glow. When he finally gathered the strength to push himself upright, he was met with a horrifying sight. He was no longer in the forest. No, this was something far worse. He was standing in what appeared to be a vast ancient hall. The walls were lined with grotesque statues, figures twisted in agony, their faces contorted in silent screams. The ceiling arched high above him, covered in intricate carvings of forgotten symbols, all painted in dark, ominous reds and blacks. The air smelled like decay, like the lingering remnants of death itself, and beneath it all, there was a low hum, a vibration in the air that James could feel deep within his chest. And standing before him, watching him, was the figure. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were others. Shadows, human forms, or what once had been human, surrounded him, standing motionless, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their faces blank and empty. Their bodies were skeletal, their skin stretched taut over their bones, and their movements were jerky, like marionettes. James's blood ran cold as he realized what they were: spirits, trapped souls, bound to this place for eternity. And then he understood. He wasn't alone here. Chapter 3. The Whispers in the Shadows. Part 3. The cold grip of the water around James tightened. It wasn't like any water he had ever felt before. It was heavy, as though it had substance, like liquid stone. It pressed against his chest, dragging him deeper into its inky depths. The force of the pull was relentless, but James could no longer fight against it. He tried to scream, but the water filled his mouth, silencing his words and choking his cries. Panic surged in him. His limbs flailed as the current swallowed him whole. His eyes searched the murky darkness, but all he could see was the faint outline of a shape emerging from the deep. The more he struggled, the more it seemed to pull him in, like some unseen hand was guiding him deeper into its depths, forcing him to look. Then, a voice. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" It wasn't just any voice, it was his own. His voice, distorted, reverberating in the blackness around him, but it wasn't coming from his mouth. It was coming from the water, from the dark expanse that now seemed to pulse with malevolent life. His heart hammered in his chest as the current pulled him further, deeper, the crushing pressure of the water suffocating him. He tried to reach out, to touch something, anything, but there was nothing. Only the vast emptiness of the abyss. "You were always meant to return," the voice continued, growing louder, clearer, as though it were directly in his mind. "We never let you leave." The words were like daggers, each one stabbing deeper into his consciousness. He gasped for breath, but the water filled his lungs, and the darkness seemed to close in around him, suffocating him, as if it were alive and hungry for his very soul. He reached out in desperation, his hands clawing through the water. Something cold, slimy, and inhuman brushed against his fingertips. His heart skipped a beat, and a wave of terror flooded through him. "Do you remember?" the voice asked, growing more insistent, almost pleading. "Do you remember the river? It's been waiting for you. For so long." The moment the voice spoke the words, James felt something deep within him stir. A cold, empty feeling, as though a door had opened to a place he had long forgotten. The sensation was so strong, so vivid, that he felt it almost physically, a searing emptiness in his chest. The water was no longer just a threat. It was alive with memories, pulling him down to where it had all begun. A flash of images flooded his mind, rapid and disorienting, scenes of the past that he had buried so deep within himself. A river, wide and slow-moving, its surface dark and mysterious, twisting through thick woods and jagged rocks. A small boy standing on the shore, gazing at the water with a mix of fascination and fear. James's younger self, staring at the river as if it called to him, beckoning him in a way he couldn't understand. He could hear the faint rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, and then the scream. It was his mother. He remembered the scream clearly, even now. The sound echoed in his ears, sharp and desperate, as her body was dragged beneath the river's surface, her form consumed by the darkness of the water. The memory was so vivid, so real, that James recoiled as if it were happening all over again. But it wasn't his mother who had screamed, it was him. "No, no, not again!" James screamed, his voice breaking through the surface of the water as his body was pulled deeper. The current twisted around him like tendrils of some otherworldly creature, dragging him down further, drowning out his pleas. The visions didn't stop. They only grew stronger. The boy on the shore, that was him, standing so helplessly as his mother was taken by the water. But it wasn't just his mother's death that haunted him. It was the feeling that came with it. The overwhelming sense of helplessness, of being powerless, of knowing that something terrible was coming for them and having no way to stop it. And now, that thing had returned. James's hands reached out once more, desperately searching for something solid. His fingers brushed against something slick and smooth, and in the darkness, he saw it. The face of the thing that had been waiting for him, its hollow eyes staring into his very soul. It wasn't human. It never had been. "Come to me," the voice whispered, no longer familiar but dark and cold. 1,000 voices whispering in unison. "Come to us, James. You can't escape. You belong to us, as all who drink from the river do." The coldness in his chest was unbearable now, an icy grip that crushed all the air from his lungs. He gasped, unable to breathe, unable to think. The current carried him, dragging him further, pulling him deeper into the abyss. The surface above him seemed so far away, so unreachable. Every desperate movement he made only drew him further away from the world he knew. He felt the weight of the water closing in around him, pressing against his body, suffocating him, drowning him. His mind was clouded with fear, with the visions, with the knowledge that he was beyond help, beyond salvation. "No escape," the voice whispered, so softly now, as though it were speaking directly to his soul. "The river has always claimed you. It always will." Suddenly, there was a strange stillness. The current stopped. The water calmed. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, James's body wasn't being dragged anymore. He was suspended in the water, hovering in a place where there was no up, no down, no forward, no backward. He was simply suspended in time, in space, in nothing. And then the water began to change. It was no longer the dark, foreboding abyss that it had been. Now it shimmered with an eerie, unnatural light. The murky depths cleared, revealing something horrifying beneath the surface. Shadows, swirling like serpents, wrapping around the faces of those who had drowned here before him, faces that were familiar. Faces from his past, his mother, his father, and the faces of others long forgotten. The water had become a graveyard. "Welcome home," the voice said, now clear and strong, filling the very space around him, pressing against his skull. "This is where we all come to rest, James. You are not alone. You never were." And for the first time, James understood. He understood what had happened all those years ago, and what had been waiting for him all this time. The river was not just a place of death. It was a place of convergence, a place where the lost souls of the past came together to form something greater, something darker, something eternal. As the faces in the water stared up at him, their eyes hollow and empty, their mouths stretched into grotesque grins, James felt the pull once more. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was inevitable. He no longer fought. He allowed himself to sink, deeper, further into the dark depths of the river that had claimed him long ago. Chapter 4. Echoes in the Dark, Part 1. It had been 3 days since the water had claimed James. 3 days since he had been lost. swallowed whole by the river's cursed depths. But it didn't matter. Time was meaningless here, in this forgotten place where reality bent and twisted. No clocks, no windows, no way to measure how long he had been submerged in the darkness. It felt like a lifetime, though he hadn't aged a day. When he awoke, or perhaps when he emerged, it wasn't into the world he remembered. It was into something else. He was lying on the cold, damp ground, his body shivering uncontrollably. His clothes, still soaked with the river's chill, clung to his skin. He could feel the wetness of his hair against his neck, dripping with water that no longer smelled of earth, but of rot. The air was thick with a dampness that felt oppressive, as though every breath he took dragged more weight into his lungs. He tried to sit up, but a dizzying wave of nausea hit him, pulling him back to the ground. The blackness surrounding him wasn't just from the night. It was a tangible thing, an oppressive void that pressed against his very being. A darkness that didn't just obscure the light, but consumed it. His hands reached out, feeling for something, anything to anchor him. The ground beneath him was soft, like soil, but unnaturally warm, as if it were alive, breathing with him. Slowly, his hands grazed over it, feeling the texture of the earth. It wasn't just dirt, it was something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. A low, echoing hum vibrated beneath him, resonating through his entire body, as if the very ground was alive. The hum grew louder, reverberating through his chest, filling his head with a thick, maddening sound. It was as though the earth itself was speaking to him, whispering in a language he couldn't comprehend. "You've returned," a voice echoed, soft yet clear, like a distant echo from an unseeable source. "We've been waiting for you." James froze. His pulse quickened as the voice settled in his ears, like a lover's whisper, intimate and cold. His body tensed, muscles locking in terror, but he couldn't move. The voice had a weight to it, heavy, as though it was pressed against the inside of his skull. The air thickened, and the sense of something watching him from the shadows crept into his bones. With a strained breath, he forced himself to sit up. The effort left him feeling weaker than ever, his head spinning, but he had no choice. He needed to see. The world around him was nothing like the forest he had known. The trees, if they could even be called trees, were twisted and gnarled, their bark blackened and peeling, with branches that curled like claws reaching for the sky. There was no moon, no stars, just an endless inky black sky, as if the night itself had swallowed the heavens. The air was suffocating, thick. Each breath felt like inhaling ash, and James found himself struggling to fill his lungs. The quiet was maddening, suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. It felt like being inside a tomb. Not a single sound, not even the distant rustling of wind through leaves. But then, there it was again. The hum, the pulse of the earth, thrumming in the silence, echoing louder now, as if whatever lay beneath this cursed soil was waking. He staggered to his feet, his knees shaking, the ground beneath him seeming to shift like quicksand. Every step felt uncertain, as though the earth itself wanted to pull him back into its depths. "Where am I?" James whispered to the void, though he knew no answer would come. The shadows around him seemed to thicken. No longer were they simply darkness. They moved, rippling like smoke in the corner of his vision. When he blinked, they were gone, leaving only the eerie stillness behind. He could feel them, though, watching, crawling just beyond the edges of his awareness, like a presence just out of reach. Then, something shifted in the corner of his eye. A figure, dark, tall, and impossibly thin, standing motionless amidst the trees. Its presence was so unnatural that it sent a wave of icy dread through James's veins. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The figure didn't respond, but he could feel it watching him. Its eyes, or at least where its eyes should have been, fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The silence between them grew unbearable, stretching out like an eternity. Then the figure stepped forward, its long, spindly limbs moving with unnatural grace. James tried to step back, but his legs felt like lead. Panic set in. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He was paralyzed by the gaze of this creature, this thing that seemed so wrong. He wanted to scream, but the words lodged in his throat, thick and heavy like stones. The figure opened its mouth, and James felt a chill run down his spine. The air around him grew colder still, and his breath came out in visible clouds, fogging the space around him. It spoke, its voice rasping and dry like the creaking of old wood. "You've returned, James, but you were always meant to come back." The words cut through him like a blade. A memory surged within him, a memory of the river, the cold, black water pulling him down into its depths, the force that had swallowed him whole, the suffocating grip of something far more ancient than any human could comprehend. "What do you want from me?" James's voice cracked as he finally managed to speak. His mind raced, but his body remained stiff, frozen in place. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer, its movements jerky, unnatural, like the slow unfolding of a nightmare. James felt something shift in the air, a pressure, a weight that was suffocating, like an invisible hand closing around his throat. The temperature plummeted, and he shivered violently, unable to break free of the paralysis that held him in place. "You've come for the same reason they always do," the figure said, its voice colder now, laden with malice. "The river calls you, James. It calls all of us, and now you will be part of it, forever." A scream tore through James's chest, but no sound emerged. His mouth opened, but only silence came from his throat. The figure was closer now, its face twisted and obscured by shadows, but he could feel its presence, feel it staring at him. There was nothing human about it, nothing familiar. It was something ancient, something that shouldn't exist in the world of the living. The world around him began to shift. The ground beneath his feet trembled, the trees groaning as if they were alive. Shadows stretched and contorted, reaching out to him, wrapping around his body, pulling him toward the figure. James fought with all his strength, but the darkness was too strong, too suffocating. "You cannot escape," the figure whispered, its voice rising in volume, growing louder, as if it were inside his head, inside his very soul. "The river claims all, and now it claims you." James felt himself being dragged forward into the figure's embrace. The world around him cracked and broke apart, splintering into 1,000 jagged pieces. He felt his consciousness slipping, his grip on reality fading. But through it all, he knew one thing. The river had come for him once again, and there was no escape. Chapter 4. Echoes in the Dark, Part 2. The world around James seemed to shift in ways that defied all logic. The figure, that terrible presence which had whispered his name, remained rooted to the spot as if tethered by some unseen force, but its eyes, those empty, abyssal pits, followed him wherever he turned. There was no way to escape the pull of its gaze. The shadows themselves seemed to recoil from it, retreating into the corners, leaving him alone in the center of its suffocating grip. He tried to move, his legs shaking beneath him, but the weight of the darkness around him seemed to drag him down, pulling him deeper into the earth itself. Every breath he took felt like he was inhaling something far colder than air, a substance more poisonous than smoke, as though the very atmosphere of this place was designed to choke him from the inside out. "You don't understand," the figure rasped, its voice a guttural scrape against his mind. "You think you can escape, but there is no escape. Not from the river. Not from this place." James tried to speak, tried to force the words out of his throat, but his lips felt numb. His chest burned with an unexplainable tightness. He could feel his heartbeat, thudding painfully in his ears, drowning out every thought except for one. Escape. Escape from the haunting shadow that loomed over him, the malevolent force that had torn him from his life, that had dragged him to this forsaken place. He had to get away. There had to be a way out. The figure moved then, the air around it shimmering with a strange energy, like the very fabric of reality was warping with each step it took. Its movements were slow, deliberate, its limbs too long, too unnaturally thin to be anything human. The skin stretched taut across its bones, an ashen grey that seemed to glisten with moisture. There were no eyes, no visible mouth, but James could feel its gaze pressing into him, reading his every thought, every fear. "You are not alone here, James," it said, its voice now filled with a cold, unsettling echo. Not anymore. They are here too. James's heart skipped a beat. He tried to look around, desperate to make sense of what it meant. But the shadows, the thick darkness, obscured everything in his path. Who? He whispered, his voice hoarse, barely a breath. Who are you talking about? The figure leaned forward, its body bending impossibly, as if its joints had no true structure. It towered over him now, blocking out all light, consuming everything. Its presence was a crushing weight, pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. And then, he saw them. Figures in the distance, moving like shadows, but not quite. They were indistinct, fading in and out of view, as though they existed in some other realm, a place just beyond the veil of this world. Their faces, if they could even be called faces, were obscured by the darkness. And yet, James could feel their eyes upon him, watching, waiting. "You're not the first to wander here," the figure said, its voice now tinged with something that sounded like amusement. "And you won't be the last." The figures started to move toward him, slow, deliberate steps that seemed to stretch the passage of time. Their bodies were not fully formed, their shapes only half real, as though they were composed of the very shadows themselves. And yet, the sensation of being watched, of being hunted, was undeniable. James stumbled backward, his breath quick and shallow. His mind was spinning, the reality of his situation crashing down on him. He had seen the river swallow him whole. He had felt the cold embrace of the water. And now, it seemed, he had been pulled into a place between life and death, a place where the laws of nature had no dominion, where time itself was an illusion, and where the souls of the lost wandered endlessly. "Please," James whispered, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please let me go. I don't belong here." But the figure only tilted its head, as if studying him. Its presence seemed to grow, swelling like a tide around him, and then, without warning, it smiled, if a smile could be called that. Its face stretched unnaturally, a grotesque distortion of a human expression, revealing a mouth full of jagged, needle-like teeth, sharp as broken glass. "You never belonged anywhere," the figure hissed, its voice a grotesque mockery of kindness. "You never belonged in the world you came from. Not truly. Not like they did." The figures in the distance began to converge on him. James could hear their soft, uneven footsteps. Thump, 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 the sound sending chills up his spine. It was like a funeral procession, each step an echo of inevitability, and with each passing second, the oppressive weight of the darkness around him seemed to grow heavier. He could no longer feel the ground beneath his feet. The air had turned to stone. "What do you want from me?" James managed to force out, his voice no longer steady, but quivering with fear. The figure took another step forward. The shadows that clung to it seemed to writhe, as if alive, licking the air in search of something to consume. "You've already given it to us," the figure crooned, its voice slithering into his mind. "What remains is just the formality, the transition." James' legs finally gave way, and he sank to his knees, his body weak, trembling uncontrollably. The darkness was closing in, swallowing him whole, but he could still see the figures moving toward him. Their shapes were no longer a blur, but solidifying, growing clearer, revealing faces twisted in agony, distorted by their suffering. They were lost souls. Like him. "No," James thought. "I'm not like them." But his words held no weight here, not in this place. As the figures closed in, he felt the first touch, a cold, clammy hand on his shoulder. The touch was like death itself, freezing him from the inside out. It spread through his skin like ice water, until he felt as if his veins were filled with liquid frost. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. "There is no escaping the river," a voice said, and this time, James recognized it. It was his own voice, distant and cold, echoing back to him from the shadows. There is only being consumed by it. And just as that realization struck him, the world around him seemed to fracture. The shadows pulled at him, yanking him downward, the ground beneath him giving way like sand slipping through an hourglass. His body felt weightless, as if he were falling through an endless void, with the lost souls surrounding him, screaming, writhing, trapped in the same eternal nightmare that he now found himself in. James tried to scream, to reach out, to fight it, but the darkness swallowed him whole. And the river that had claimed him, was there, waiting. Chapter 5. The River of Lost Souls. James awoke in darkness, though it wasn't the kind of darkness that simply envelops a room when the lights are turned off. This was something far worse, a thick, suffocating void that pressed against his skin, chilling him to the very bone. He couldn't see, couldn't hear, could barely breathe. The air felt viscous, sticky, as though it was alive and trying to pull him into the abyss. His pulse hammered in his ears, sweat slicked his skin, but it wasn't the kind of sweat that comes from fear. It was as though the very essence of his body was being drawn out, absorbed by the darkness around him. He tried to move, to rise, but his limbs felt like they were bound, heavy with some unseen force that kept him grounded in place. The memory of what happened before rushed back with horrifying clarity. The figure, the souls, the river. He had been pulled into this place, this nightmarish purgatory, and now he was trapped in a world where nothing was real and everything was malevolent. No, this can't be real, he thought. It's just a nightmare. I'll wake up. I have to wake up. But as his mind struggled to reject the reality of his situation, a voice cut through the oppressive silence. A low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. It sent a tremor through his entire body. "You never left," it hissed, the words crawling under his skin like insects. "You're still here, and you always will be." James's heart skipped a beat. He twisted his head in every direction, but there was no source of the voice. It was everywhere, filling the very air around him, wrapping itself around his thoughts, sinking into the deepest recesses of his mind. "You think you can escape," the voice continued, "but the river doesn't let go. It never lets go. You are its chosen. You belong to it now." Chosen? James thought. Chosen for what? Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled, as though some enormous unseen force was rippling through the space around him. The temperature dropped sharply, the air growing colder than he had ever felt. His breath came out in white puffs, but it wasn't the cold that terrified him. It was what came next. The ground cracked open in front of him, wide fissures splitting through the earth like the mouth of some monstrous beast, eager to devour him whole. From the depths of the cracks came a faint, echoing sound. Whispers, chants, a language he could not comprehend. The sound was soft at first, a mere murmur beneath the surface, but it grew louder, more insistent. And with it, the shadows that had been surrounding him began to twist and move, forming shapes that were too monstrous, too grotesque to be understood. The whispers became voices, clear, articulate, but filled with agony, their tones twisted with eternal suffering. "James, James, you must join us." He recoiled, his mind screaming for him to run, to flee, but his legs wouldn't obey. The darkness pressed against him, and then the first shadow emerged from the void, slithering across the broken earth. It had no form, no defined edges, just an amorphous mass of writhing tendrils that seemed to stretch forever, moving like liquid in the air. "We are all lost," the shadow spoke, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "We are all drowning in the river, just like you. You belong to us now. Your soul will feed this endless current." The words stung like venom, and James gasped for air, his chest tight with panic. His pulse quickened as more shadows began to emerge from the cracks in the ground, their forms indistinguishable from the surrounding darkness. He couldn't see their faces, but he felt their presence, unfathomable, predatory, hungry. "There is no escape," they all whispered in unison, their voices rising in a discordant symphony of madness. "You are part of us now. You will be the river's vessel. The river will consume you, and in time, it will consume the world." A sickening sensation crawled up James's spine, like a cold hand sliding up his back. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the horrors, but the images kept coming. The shadows were closing in, their forms coiling around him, tightening with each breath. His body was frozen, unable to move, unable to scream. The voices continued, louder now, louder than ever, filling his ears, blocking out his thoughts. And then, the river. The ground beneath him shuddered again, and the air thickened with the sound of rushing water. James could hear the roar of the river now, not far off, so close, as though it was right beside him, just beyond the darkness. The river had come for him, just as the figure had promised. It was the one thing in this world that had power over him, more than the shadows, more than the voices. The river was the source of his torment, the thing that had claimed him and would never let him go. "It's time," the voice from before murmured, a final whisper that slid into his ear like a blade. "You belong to the river. You will become one with it, just like all the others before you." Without warning, the ground beneath him gave way, and James fell. He fell into the abyss, deeper and deeper. As the sound of rushing water grew deafening, it roared around him, filling his ears, drowning out every other sound. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The darkness consumed him, the cold water enveloping him, pulling him under. The river was here, and as it pulled him down into its depths, James understood the horrifying truth. There was no escape. Chapter 6. The River's Call. James felt his body break free from the grip of the dark abyss, but his mind remained submerged in the crushing void, tethered to something ancient, malevolent. The river pulled at him, dragging him deeper and deeper, its current a cold and relentless force. He tried to scream, but the water filled his mouth, choking him, forcing him into silence. His limbs thrashed in a desperate attempt to swim, but the river's power was too much, far beyond anything he could comprehend. "It's all futile." The thought clawed at his mind, a gnawing certainty. No matter how much he struggled, no matter how hard he fought, he would never escape the river's grip. The sound of rushing water was deafening now, drowning everything else. The whispers, the shadows, the faint remnants of the world he had once known. All that remained was the river, its unending flow, a torrent that carried him with it, farther from anything familiar. The pull of the water was magnetic, a dark force that filled the very air around him. It was all-consuming, its presence suffocating. He sank further into the depths, the current pulling him down, deeper into the dark heart of the river. The water, black and viscous, pressed in on all sides, wrapping itself around him like a suffocating shroud. Every time he tried to fight back, to push against the relentless pull, it dragged him deeper. His lungs burned for air, but there was none. He could feel the weight of the water pressing down on him, as though it were alive, as though it was devouring him piece by piece. No. This can't be real, James thought, his mind still clinging to the remnants of reality, even as his body sank into the dark depths. Suddenly, a flash of light broke through the darkness, a fleeting glimpse of something above him, a silhouette, distant and unreal, but unmistakable. It was the figure from before, the one who had beckoned him, who had shown him the path to this cursed river. James could feel a chill settle in his chest as he tried to reach out, to call out, but his voice was swallowed by the water. "You can't escape," the voice echoed, a deep, low rumble that reverberated through the water, vibrating in his bones. "You are mine now. There is no turning back." The figure in the distance began to move, its form shifting and distorting, stretching out like the tendrils of the river itself. As it moved, the water seemed to churn around it, parting like a veil, revealing glimpses of what lay beneath. Shadows, whispers, faces, all swirling together in the blackened depths. James felt his stomach twist with fear, the reality of his situation sinking in. He was drowning, not just in water, but in something far worse, something that had no end, no escape. The figure in the distance was growing closer now, its movements deliberate, slow, almost predatory. With each passing second, it drew nearer, and James could feel the weight of its gaze, a presence that pressed down on him, suffocating him. "You are a part of this now," the voice continued. And this time, it was not just in his mind. It was all around him, the river itself speaking through the whispers of the water. "You belong to the river, and in time, the river will claim all of you, all of your soul, all of your memories, all of your life. It will be consumed, devoured, lost to the endless flow. As the figure drew closer, James could see its features more clearly now. Its face, pale and lifeless, its eyes wide and empty, as if it had never known anything other than the river's pull. There was no expression in its gaze, no sorrow, no joy, just the hollow, relentless stare of something trapped, something lost to the current. "You are just like me," the figure whispered, its voice soft yet commanding. "You will never escape. You will never be free." The words struck James like a physical blow, the finality of them echoing in his chest. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. He couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. All that remained was the endless, suffocating darkness and the cold grip of the river. The water around him grew colder still, and he could feel the sharp, biting chill of the river's embrace seeping into his bones. He thought he saw something else, something moving in the depths beneath the surface of the water, shadows flickering and shifting, as if there were creatures lurking just out of sight, waiting to drag him further into the abyss. He tried to look away, but the pull of the river was irresistible. He was drawn back toward the figure, whose empty gaze never wavered. "The river does not forget," it murmured. "The river takes what it is owed." James's heart pounded in his chest as the figure reached out, its hand hovering just above his own. The coldness from its touch radiated outward, freezing his very soul. It was too much to bear. His mind screamed for release, for an end, but there was none. The figure's fingers brushed against his, and for a brief moment, he felt a surge of darkness flood into him, a presence far older, far more powerful than anything he had ever known. "You will know what it means to be forgotten," the figure said, its voice barely more than a whisper now, but its words filled with an inescapable weight. "You will become one with the river, and in time, you will forget too. Everything. Your name, your life, your soul. You will become the river." As the figure's hand closed around his, James felt the very core of his being begin to unravel. His memories, his identity, everything he had once known, began to dissolve, slipping away like sand through his fingers. The river was consuming him, piece by piece, until all that was left was the endless, pulsing current. The water filled his lungs once more, and he was drowning, not just in the river, but in the eternity it represented. The last thing he saw before the darkness fully claimed him was the figure's face, staring at him with those hollow, empty eyes, and the ripples of the river flowing over him, pulling him deeper into the void. Chapter 7. The Depths of Memory. The river had been silent for days. Silent, but not empty. James had learned that silence was often the most dangerous sound of all. It was the calm before the storm, the moment where the weight of what was to come hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The oppressive quiet wrapped around him like a shroud, and though he tried to ignore it, the silence gnawed at his mind. It wasn't natural. It wasn't right. The water was still. There were no ripples, no echoes of movement beneath the surface. It was as if the river itself had fallen into a deep, unnatural sleep. But he knew better than to believe in such illusions. The river had never slept. It had only ever waited, waiting for the right moment to strike. James had long since lost track of time. Days, weeks, months. How could he know? There was no sun here, no moon, no rhythm of the earth to anchor him. All he had now was the water, and the figure that haunted the edges of his vision. He could feel its presence at all times, even when it wasn't there. He could hear its whispers, its beckoning call, urging him deeper into the river's depths. In his dreams, if you could still call them dreams, James found himself walking through strange landscapes that didn't seem to belong to the world he had once known. These places were twisted, distorted, and somehow alien, yet intimately familiar. He had seen them before, in fragments of memory that flickered and twisted away when he tried to reach them. Each dream was the same. Each dream was a journey into the dark heart of his own mind, a path that led deeper and deeper into the forgotten parts of himself. He would find himself standing at the edge of the river, staring into the endless, swirling blackness, and there, in the water's depths, would be his own reflection. But it was never quite him. It was something darker, something older, something that had been hidden away for far too long. At first, He had tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him, that the river had done nothing more than warp his perception. But with each passing night, the dreams grew stronger, more vivid. The reflection in the water began to move on its own, reaching out to him, pulling at him with an unrelenting force. And in those moments, when his hand brushed against the water, when his skin touched the surface, he could feel it. Something was awakening inside him, something that had been buried deep within his soul. Something he had forgotten long ago was stirring, stretching, reaching for the surface. It was then that he realized the truth. There was no escape from the river, not physically, not mentally, not spiritually. He had already been claimed by it. And now, he was being drawn into the very depths of his own soul. The water, he understood now, was more than just a river. It was a doorway, a passage into something far older, far more ancient. It was a living thing, a force that existed beyond time, beyond the boundaries of space. It was a memory that stretched back through the ages, to a time before he had ever known life. And it was calling him back to where it all began. Phansompum. Part 2. The Awakened Memory. James awoke with a start, his chest heaving as if he had been running through the endless, oppressive darkness of the river. His heart pounded in his ears, the sound deafening in the stillness of the night. Sweat drenched his body, his skin cold and clammy, and for a moment he thought he could still hear the whispers, faint but unmistakable, calling out to him. He blinked rapidly, trying to shake the remnants of the dream from his mind, but the images lingered, vivid, inescapable. The twisted landscapes, the reflection in the water, the shadowed figure that seemed to watch him with those cold, empty eyes. It's just a dream, he told himself, though his voice trembled in his throat. Just a dream. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He had seen those places before. He had felt them. The river was not just a place. It was a memory, a link to something buried in his past, something he had forgotten, something he wasn't supposed to remember. He sat up in the dark, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of his bed. The silence pressed in on him, suffocating, but it was different this time. It wasn't the silence of the river. It wasn't the oppressive quiet that had swallowed him whole before. No, this silence was a lull before something more terrible. The sound of the river echoed faintly in his mind, distant but insistent. The memory of it, the feel of the water, the cold, the pull, the way it had wrapped itself around him, consumed him, was like a weight in his chest, suffocating and unrelenting. The river is waiting. The thought came unbidden, sharp and cold. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but it felt like one. A deep, resonating voice that came from within him. It was his voice, but it was not. It was a voice he had forgotten, a voice that had been buried beneath the river's dark currents. The memories came in fragments, glimpses, flashes of images that were both familiar and alien. A childhood home. A mother, her face twisted in fear, her eyes wide and pleading. A father standing in the doorway, his eyes vacant, as if he had already left the world long before his body had. The river, always the river, the call of it. James shuddered, his mind whirling as he tried to make sense of the fragments. He had been here before, hadn't he? He had stood at the edge of this river, looking into the black waters, listening to its call, knowing that it was coming for him. But he hadn't been alone, had he? There had been others who had been there with him, standing by his side, urging him forward, urging him into the water. Who were they? As the questions piled up in his mind, James felt something stir deep within him, a sense of recognition, a flicker of something he couldn't name. His breath caught in his throat as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. It was as if the river was trying to tell him something important, something he had forgotten. The room around him began to distort, the edges of reality blurring as the memories grew more vivid. He could feel the presence of something, someone, lurking just beyond the edge of his perception. The air thickened, the temperature dropping as the shadows lengthened, creeping across the walls. "You cannot hide from the river," the voice whispered again, this time louder, more insistent. "You belong to it now. You always have. James felt his pulse quicken. He closed his eyes tightly, desperate to escape, but the whispers only grew louder. The presence, whatever it was growing stronger, closer. He could feel it, like a weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. Suddenly the door creaked open, and James spun around, his heart leaping in his chest. But there was no one there, just the emptiness, the cold silence. And then he heard it, the sound of the river, closer now, louder, echoing through the very walls of the room. Chapter 7. The depths of memory. The river had been silent for days, silent but not empty. James had learned that silence was often the most dangerous sound of all. It was the calm before the storm, the moment where the weight of what was to come hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The oppressive quiet wrapped around him like a shroud, and though he tried to ignore it, the silence gnawed at his mind. It wasn't natural. It wasn't right. The water was still. There were no ripples, no echoes of movement beneath the surface. It was as if the river itself had fallen into a deep, unnatural sleep. But he knew better than to believe in such illusions. The river had never slept. It had only ever waited, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. James had long since lost track of time. Days, weeks, months. How could he know? There was no sun here, no moon, no rhythm of the earth to anchor him. All he had now was the water and the figure that haunted the edges of his vision. He could feel its presence at all times, even when it wasn't there. He could hear its whispers, its beckoning call, urging him deeper into the river's depths. In his dreams, if you could still call them dreams, James found himself walking through strange landscapes that didn't seem to belong to the world he had once known. These places were twisted, distorted, and somehow alien, yet intimately familiar. He had seen them before, in fragments of memory that flickered and twisted away when he tried to reach them. Each dream was the same. Each dream was a journey into the dark heart of his own mind, a path that led deeper and deeper into the forgotten parts of himself. He would find himself standing at the edge of the river, staring into the endless, swirling blackness, and there, in the water's depths, would be his own reflection. But it was never quite him. It was something darker, something older, something that had been hidden away for far too long. At first, he had tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him, that the river had done nothing more than warp his perception. But with each passing night, the dreams grew stronger, more vivid. The reflection in the water began to move on its own, reaching out to him, pulling at him with an unrelenting force. And in those moments, when his hand brushed against the water, when his skin touched the surface, he could feel it. Something was awakening inside him, something that had been buried deep within his soul. Something he had forgotten long ago was stirring, stretching, reaching for the surface. It was then that he realized the truth. There was no escape from the river. Not physically, not mentally, not spiritually. He had already been claimed by it, and now he was being drawn into the very depths of his own soul. The water, he understood now, was more than just a river. It was a doorway, a passage into something far older, far more ancient. It was a living thing, a force that existed beyond time, beyond the boundaries of space. It was a memory that stretched back through the ages, to a time before he had ever known life. And it was calling him back to where it all began. Part 2. The Awakened Memory. James awoke with a start, his chest heaving as if he had been running through the endless, oppressive darkness of the river. His heart pounded in his ears, the sound deafening in the stillness of the night. Sweat drenched his body, his skin cold and clammy, and for a moment he thought he could still hear the whispers, faint but unmistakable, calling out to him. He blinked rapidly, trying to shake the remnants of the dream from his mind. But the images lingered, vivid, inescapable. The twisted landscapes, the reflection in the water, the shadowed figure that seemed to watch him with those cold, empty eyes. It's just a dream, he told himself, though his voice trembled in his throat. Just a dream. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He had seen those places before. He had felt them. The river was not just a place. It was a memory a link to something buried in his past, something he had forgotten, something he wasn't supposed to remember. He sat up in the dark, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of his bed. The silence pressed in on him, suffocating, but it was different this time. It wasn't the silence of the river. It wasn't the oppressive quiet that had swallowed him whole before. No, this silence was a lull before something more terrible. The sound of the river echoed faintly in his mind, distant but insistent. The memory of it, the feel of the water, the cold, the pull, the way it had wrapped itself around him, consumed him, was like a weight in his chest, suffocating and unrelenting. The river is waiting. The thought came unbidden, sharp and cold. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but it felt like one. A deep, resonating voice that came from within him. It was his voice, but it was not. It was a voice he had forgotten, a voice that had been buried beneath the river's dark currents. The memories came in fragments, glimpses, flashes of images that were both familiar and alien. A childhood home, a mother, her face twisted in fear, her eyes wide and pleading. A father, standing in the doorway, his eyes vacant, as if he had already left the world long before his body had. The river, always the river, the call of it. James shuddered, his mind whirling as he tried to make sense of the fragments. He had been here before, hadn't he? He had stood at the edge of this river, looking into the black waters, listening to its call, knowing that it was coming for him. But he hadn't been alone, had he? There had been others who had been there with him, standing by his side, urging him forward, urging him into the water. Who were they? As the questions piled up in his mind, James felt something stir deep within him, a sense of recognition, a flicker of something he couldn't name. His breath caught in his throat as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. It was as if the river was trying to tell him something important, something he had forgotten. The room around him began to distort, the edges of reality blurring as the memories grew more vivid. He could feel the presence of someone, lurking just beyond the edge of his perception. The air thickened, the temperature dropping as the shadows lengthened, creeping across the walls. "You cannot hide from the river," the voice whispered again, this time louder, more insistent. "You belong to it now. You always have." James felt his pulse quicken. He closed his eyes tightly, desperate to escape, but the whispers only grew louder. The presence, whatever it was growing stronger, closer. He could feel it, like a weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and James spun around, his heart leaping in his chest. But there was no one there, just the emptiness, the cold silence. And then, he heard it, the sound of the river, closer now, louder, echoing through the very walls of the room. Chapter 8. The shifting shadows. The house had grown colder, or perhaps it was him. James couldn't tell anymore. Every night, the temperature seemed to drop by a fraction, imperceptible yet suffocating. The shadows seemed to grow, as if creeping in from every corner, curling into every nook, inching closer until they felt alive. Alive in ways that terrified him, in ways that he couldn't put into words. The shadows whispered, but not in the way the wind did, not in the soft, comforting way it sometimes did through the trees. These whispers were sharp, jagged. They scratched at his mind, pulling him deeper into their folds. It had been weeks since he'd left the house. Days, nights, it all blurred together in the slow crawl of time. The river, though, he could never escape the river. Its call had become an obsession, an imprint on his soul, as if every part of his body longed to return to its dark depths. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw it, its cold black water swirling endlessly. Sometimes he could almost taste it. The heaviness of the river's pull was like a vice around his chest, tightening with each passing hour. He had tried to ignore it. He tried to remind himself that this was all just a bad dream, just a trick of his mind unraveling. But the more he tried to deny it, the more intense the visions became. It wasn't just the river either. There was something in the house, something in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very air he breathed. He could feel it. A presence, unseen yet palpable, pressing down on him. It was waiting for him, watching him. He could no longer tell where the house ended and the dark forest outside began. The trees pressed against the windows, their gnarled branches scratching the glass like fingers in the night, begging for entry. The house had become its own twisted reflection of the river, a stagnant, decaying pool where memories dissolved and reformed into something unrecognizable. James sat in the armchair by the fireplace, his eyes fixed on the flickering flame that had long since lost its warmth. The fire had become a strange comfort, but it wasn't real comfort. It was a temporary distraction. The shadows moved within the flames, twisting and bending, a reflection of something else, something darker. They danced on the edges of his vision like the afterimage of a terrible memory. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days, weeks maybe. The isolation had become both a refuge and a curse. In the silence, he could hear the whispering voices. They had started faintly, as distant as the wind through the trees. But now, they were closer, and they were speaking his name. James! He jolted upright, his heart pounding in his chest. The whisper was like a cold hand gripping his spine, sending shivers through his entire body. It had come from the hallway outside the room, but there was no one there. James! Again the voice called, but this time it was different. It was clearer, almost familiar. He stood, his legs shaky, his pulse quickening. His breath was shallow, his chest tight as he moved cautiously toward the door. The whispers continued, now joined by a low, guttural murmur. A wordless sound, like the rustling of 1,000 unseen feet in the dark. As he reached the door, he felt a strange compulsion. The urge to open it, to step into the darkness that lay just beyond the threshold, was overwhelming. Something was pulling him forward. He didn't know what. He didn't care. He opened the door. The hallway was empty, the shadows thick and oppressive, but they didn't seem as empty as they should. He could almost feel the weight of them pressing against him, moving closer with every breath. The air was colder now, his breath visible in the dim light. He could hear something scratching against the walls, a faint noise, like nails on stone. The walls themselves seemed to pulse, breathing in rhythm with the low, deep murmur that filled the house. He moved forward, his footsteps muffled on the old wood floor, his heart hammering in his chest. There was something at the end of the hallway, a faint flicker of movement just beyond his reach. He couldn't make it out at first, just a blur, a shadow. But as he drew closer, it became clear. It was a figure, a shape, standing still in the darkness. James froze. His blood ran cold. There was something about the figure, something wrong, something off about it. It looked like a person, a human, but its movements were unnatural, jerky, twisted. The figure raised its head slowly, and for a split second, James thought he saw his own face reflected in the dark, hollow eyes. He blinked, but the figure was gone, vanished, and yet the sound continued. The murmur, the scratching, the breathing. He backed away, his heart pounding, sweat beading on his forehead. He reached for the light switch, but the power was out. Of course, he hadn't had electricity in days. The house had fallen into disrepair, and it had grown increasingly harder to keep track of time. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen anyone. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard a human voice, but he remembered the river. The river had always been there. Come to me, the voice whispered again. But now it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command, a pull, deep from the shadows. Come to me, James. He stumbled backward, colliding with the wall. His mind screamed at him to turn around, to run, to escape. But there was nowhere to go. The house was too vast, too empty. The walls were closing in on him. The shadows were all around him. And then he felt it. A cold hand, ghostly and insubstantial, brushed against his arm. It was in that moment, when the darkness seemed to engulf him, when the whispers became a chorus, that he understood. The river hadn't just claimed him. It had claimed the house as well. It had seeped into the walls, into the foundation, into the very bones of the house itself. It had become part of it, part of him. James pressed his palm to his forehead, trying to block out the visions, the memories that flooded his mind. The river, his mother's voice, distant and soft, his father's face, hollow and empty. He saw himself, a child, standing on the banks of the river, looking into the depths. He had known what was coming. He had always known. "We are the river," the voice said, louder now, clearer, stronger than ever. "You are the river." James gasped, his breath ragged, as the shadows closed in around him, wrapping around his body, binding him to the house. The pull of the river was inescapable, and the whispers filled his mind, drowning out all else. There was no escape from this place. Not from the house, not from the river. He was trapped. Chapter 9. The Unraveling. The night stretched on like an endless expanse of cold, a suffocating darkness that seemed to fold in on itself. James stood at the center of the room, unable to move, as if his feet were bound by invisible chains. The house creaked around him, the floorboards groaning under the weight of time, but it wasn't the house itself that made his skin crawl. It was the whispers, the voices, the eyes that seemed to watch him from every corner, from every shadow. He felt it again, the chill in the air that wasn't simply the absence of warmth. It was something else, something older, more malevolent. The air itself felt thick, as though it had been poisoned by something beyond human understanding. "It's coming," the voice murmured, its echo rising from deep within the house, rising from the very foundation of the earth. James had heard the voice before, but it was different now, deeper, angrier. It was more than a whisper. It was an insistent call, a beckoning that he couldn't escape, even if he tried. And deep within him, a part of him didn't want to escape. He had been searching for the truth, hadn't he? For answers, for understanding. But now, he realized he had opened a door that could never be closed. The house was no longer just a structure. It had become a living, breathing thing. It had a pulse, a heart that beat beneath the walls, beneath the floors, beneath his very skin. He could feel it now, this pulse, as if the house itself was alive, throbbing with dark energy, pulling at the strings of his mind. "It wants you," the voice continued. "You're not meant to leave, not now, not after everything." James staggered backward, his breath shallow and ragged. The room seemed to tilt, the walls pressing in on him, the floor beneath him warping as though the very dimensions of the house had changed. The shadows swirled like living things, reaching out to touch him with tendrils of cold, with a clammy grip that made his skin crawl. He closed his eyes, trying to block it out, but the darkness was inside him now. The whispers didn't stop. They only grew louder, more insistent, like the sound of rushing water, the sound of the river that had haunted him for so long. "Come to the river," it whispered again, like a lullaby sung from the depths of the abyss. "It's where you belong." He shook his head, his pulse racing. The river. He had been running from it for so long, but no matter how far he went, it was always there. It called to him. And in his weakest moments, he had wanted to listen. He had wanted to surrender to its dark embrace. The pull was irresistible, like gravity, like a force that he couldn't explain. He turned his head to the window, looking out into the darkened world beyond. The moon was hidden behind a blanket of clouds, and the only light came from the flickering candle in the room. The shadows danced and moved in the dimness, mocking him, taunting him. There was no escape from them. No escape from this house, from the darkness. "You think you can fight it?" the voice asked, mocking him, whispering its cruel laughter in his ear. "You think you can run?" A cold hand brushed his shoulder, and he spun around, his heart leaping in his chest. But there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty room, the flickering light, and the weight of silence pressing down on him. He could hear it now, the sound of something moving in the walls. A slow, deliberate scraping, nails on stone, scratching, like the sound of something trying to break free. It was in the walls, the floors, the very foundation of the house. Something was trying to get out. James's breathing quickened, his chest tightening as the air grew colder. The whispers were now a cacophony of voices, overlapping, indistinguishable from one another. They spoke of the river, of the things that waited in the depths. They spoke of his mother, of his father, of his lost past. They spoke of the things he had buried deep inside, things he had tried to forget, tried to leave behind. He didn't want to listen, but the voices were impossible to ignore. They crawled into his ears, filling his mind with visions. The river, the black, cold water, his feet slipping on the muddy bank, his mother's voice calling him from the depths, his father's face, a hollow mask of terror, the sinking, the drowning, the suffocating silence. "It's waiting for you," the voice whispered again. And this time James didn't flinch. He knew the truth now. The house, the river, the darkness. It was all one. It had always been one. And he was part of it. His hand, almost of its own accord, reached out to the old journal lying on the table. The leather was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. He had read it once, long ago, but he hadn't understood. Now, as his fingers traced the faded words, the meaning was clear. He knew what he had to do. He had to go to the river, to the source of all of this. The answers were there, at the bottom of that black, swirling void. "There's no escape," the voice whispered. "Only the river, only the end." And yet, despite the overwhelming dread that churned in his gut, there was a part of him that felt calm, a part of him that welcomed the inevitable. At the echoes of the river. The journey to the river felt like an eternity. James didn't remember how he had gotten there, whether he had walked, driven, or something else entirely. The path before him seemed to stretch and twist in impossible directions, as though the very land itself was shifting and changing, folding in on itself. The darkness pressed in, surrounding him on all sides. There were no stars in the sky, no light from the moon. The world was swallowed by an impenetrable blackness. But there was a sound, a distant rhythmic sound, the sound of water moving, of something vast and unstoppable. The river. He followed the sound, each step heavy, as if the ground itself was pulling him downward. The earth seemed to give way beneath him, and he stumbled, barely able to keep his footing. His mind screamed at him to turn back, but the river called louder. It was a pull, deep and primal, impossible to resist. At last he reached it. The river was not what he expected. It was not the peaceful, flowing stream he remembered from his childhood, but a massive, dark expanse. The water was still, black as ink, and yet there was movement beneath the surface. Something shifted in the depths, something that he could not see but could feel. "Step in," the voice whispered. He hesitated, but the pull was too strong. Slowly, cautiously, he waded into the water. The cold hit him like a shock, seeping through his clothes, biting at his skin. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. The river held him now, as it had always held him. As he sank deeper into the water, he could hear it. Voices, soft at first, rising up from the depths. The river was speaking to him, calling his name, telling him stories of forgotten things, of things that had been buried, erased from time. He could hear the echoes of the past, of everything that had led him here. And then he saw it, the thing that had been waiting for him. A figure, rising from the depths. It was his mother, but not his mother, not really. Her face was a mask of decay, her skin stretched tight over hollow bones. Her eyes were wide, empty, black as the river itself, and her mouth opened, and a voice that was not hers spoke. "Welcome home, James." And as the darkness closed in around him, James understood. Chapter 10. The End and the Beginning. The moment his mother's eyes locked onto his, everything fell away. Time ceased to exist. The world, once so tangible, now felt like a distant memory, as though it had never been real at all. There was only the river, only the black void of her hollow gaze, pulling him deeper and deeper into the water's suffocating grip. "Welcome home, James," the voice rasped, but it wasn't hers. No, it was something darker, something that crawled up from the very depths of the river. Her lips never moved, but the words vibrated in his mind, thrumming like a pulse, a heartbeat, his heartbeat. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The cold of the water numbed him, its depths pulling him downward, toward the heart of the river, toward something ancient and monstrous that had waited for him all these years. The blackness pressed in from all sides, swallowing him whole, until there was nothing left, nothing but the voice, the unholy voice. "You've come home at last," it whispered, and this time It was his mother's voice again, soft and full of sorrow. "I've waited for you, James, for so long." His lungs burned, his chest constricted. He needed air. He needed to break free. But no matter how hard he kicked, no matter how desperately he tried to swim toward the surface, he was pulled deeper. His body was sinking, and with it, his sanity. The river had become his world now, his entire existence, and he knew, without a doubt, that he would never leave. The water filled his mouth, his throat, his eyes. The darkness surged around him like a living thing, crawling beneath his skin, burrowing into his soul. His mother's face, twisted and decayed, loomed before him, her empty eyes gazing down at him as though she was studying him, waiting. "You were always meant to join us," the voice said, now louder, more insistent. "Your blood, James, is the blood of the river. It always was." James could no longer feel his body. The cold had taken him, and yet he could still sense something pulling at him, a thread that connected him to the river, to everything that had come before. The river had been there when his parents had died, when he had found himself adrift in a world that made no sense. It had called to him even then, a siren song, one he had not yet been able to hear, but now he could hear it clearly. "We are one, James," the voice breathed, so close now, as if it was in his mind, in his very soul. "We are the river. We are the dark, the forgotten, the lost. And you are the key." James couldn't fight it anymore. The weight of the water crushed him, his thoughts fractured and disjointed, his sense of self slipping away like sand through his fingers. All he could do was surrender. He let the river take him, let it consume him, and then there was silence. He woke to darkness. It wasn't the darkness of the river, though. No, this was different. This was still and cold, but there was no water. There was no weight pressing against him, no suffocating grip. Only an emptiness, a vast, yawning abyss, stretching out into nothingness. He was lying on something hard, something cold, but the cold wasn't painful anymore. It was familiar. James blinked, his eyes adjusting to the dim light that filtered in from somewhere, though he couldn't see where. The room around him seemed to hum with energy, but it wasn't the oppressive, malevolent energy of the river. No, this felt strange, but in a way that was both calming and terrifying. He pushed himself up slowly, his limbs stiff, as though they hadn't moved in years. His head throbbed, and his chest ached. He could feel the faintest remnants of the river's coldness in his bones. His skin was clammy, as though it had never fully dried. The room, if you could call it that, was unlike any place he had ever seen. It was old, very old, and yet there was a sense of timelessness to it. The walls were made of smooth, pale stone, with strange symbols etched into them, symbols that seemed to shift and change every time he looked away. The air was thick with dust, and yet there was no musty smell, no decay. The silence was absolute. James stood up shakily, his eyes scanning the room. There was a door at the far end, a door made of dark wood, with intricate carvings that twisted and writhed like the symbols on the walls. He felt an instinctive pull toward it, a need to move forward. He couldn't explain it, but he knew he had to reach it. He had to go through it. But before he could take a step, he heard a sound, a faint whisper that seemed to echo from every corner of the room. "Welcome home, James," the voice said, but this time it was no longer his mother's voice. It was something deeper, something ancient. James froze, his heart slamming against his chest. The voice had no form, no shape. It was just there, vibrating in the air, in his bones, in the marrow of his soul. It was a voice of the river, a voice of something far beyond the mortal realm. "You cannot escape, James," it said softly, almost lovingly. "You were never meant to leave." The door before him creaked, slowly beginning to open, though no one had touched it. And behind it was a darkness that no human eyes should see. James stood there, frozen, not knowing whether to step forward or turn back. But there was no turning back, not anymore. The river had already claimed him. He had crossed into its world, its domain, and it would never let him go. And so, With a final breath, he stepped forward, into the unknown. Transfer. As James stepped into the darkness, the room seemed to close in around him, the door slamming shut behind him with an almost deafening finality. The air grew colder, heavier. The silence became oppressive, and the whispering voice faded into nothingness, replaced by the dull, rhythmic sound of something far deeper than his own heartbeat. He had stepped into a place that defied understanding, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. Time had no meaning here. Memory was nothing more than a fleeting ghost. And yet, in the pit of his stomach, he knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning.